you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Perhaps the most commonly heard conspiracy theory about 9/11 is the claim that bombs may have been in the buildings that helped to bring down the towers, as well as the planes which struck them. As wild as this conspiracy theory may sound, one building, World Trade Center Building Number 7, also known as the Solomon Brothers Building, hundreds of yards away from the Twin Towers, collapsed at 5:20 in the evening on 9/11 and received very little coverage. This building was a 47-story steel-reinforced concrete structure, which collapsed into its own footprint in 6.5 seconds, 7 hours after the Twin Towers collapsed. It became the third building in history to fall due to fires, next to the first two, which were the towers. However, it was never struck by a plane. It also was not significantly damaged by the falling towers, according to the FEMA and NIST reports. Dr. Stephen Jones is a professor of physics and has this to say about the tower.
I was amazed. It follows, and I'd looked now at dozens of demolitions just to see what they look like, what is the nature, is experiments on how you bring a building down symmetrically, straight down and rapidly. You knock out the core first, the core goes down, the sidewalls lean in a little bit, and the building comes down rapidly because you've knocked out the support. Well, that's exactly how Building 7 came down. The dramatic collapse of World Trade Center 7 is something everyone ought to see. I suspect that few have actually looked at it, something that needs to be explored very carefully, but the characteristics are there. So you look at the building, you see it dip in the middle first, and the sides bow in a little bit, and then you see it come down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just like that. And right down onto its footprint. You see, that's the goal of controlled demolition. You don't want the building to tip over, which is much easier to do with explosives, actually. Just knock out the supports and let her tip. The trusses in the building made it very asymmetrical. There were 24 central columns, steel columns. For those to fail in such a way that that building would collapse in the center first and then come straight down, instead of toppling over, for instance? No.
After years of questioning and activism by the family members of victims of September 11th, thousands of government contractors, engineers, architects, and other credentialed experts have joined together and examined the collapse of the Twin Towers and have looked into Building 7. A group now calling themselves Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth combines all of these professionals and has received virtually no coverage by the mainstream media. Although media has been invited to their events, as well as over 50 different disclosure attempts set up by the family members, marches by the so-called 9/11 truthers, and press conferences, the media remains silent.
In order for the perimeter to fall perfectly and symmetrically, which it pretty much does at Building 7, all of those columns have to be removed within a tenth of a second of each other. Fire cannot do that.
The entire roofline cascades down neatly into its own footprint. At the same time, jets of debris can be seen shooting out of the walls and going up.
In the FEMA report, I think they were fairly honest, and it's interesting as you read what they said about Building 7. So, I'm reading with great interest. At the end, they say, well, our best hypothesis, now, this is the fire and damage hypothesis. That's the only hypothesis they looked at, seriously. Okay, so our best hypothesis, they said, has only a low probability of occurrence. And I'm saying, that's right. That's exactly right. Why don't you quantify that? But they didn't quantify it. But they did admit, you know, it has only a low probability of occurrence, and that's to their credit. The 9/11 Commission didn't even mention Building 7 collapse, you know.
The first column to collapse is column number 80, which was untouched by any structural damage. This is evident in the fall of the east penthouse, supported by column number 80. This precedes global collapse. But what happens next, several seconds later, is not so easily explained. Looking at photos of the building after its collapse, it is clear that the entire cage of interior columns failed. The structure piled into its own footprint. Shot at about 9 p.m. on September 11th. The U.S. Post Office is on the left. World Trade Center 7 stopped at the sidewalk along the post office. Building 7 was hundreds of yards away from the towers, across the street, while buildings 3 through 6 were in the immediate area under the falling debris. They received massive amounts of direct impact from the falling towers and maintained their integrity. And did not pancake. Objects do not increase momentum or inertia when they strike a force opposing them, but lose momentum and follow the path of least resistance, as is stated by the law of inertia. Building 7 housed the Office of Emergency Management.
Also in that building, the New York offices of the U.S. Secret Service.
And has confirmed reports that the CIA had an undercover office in 7 World Trade Center, one of the buildings destroyed along with the Twin Towers September the 11th. A U.S. official tells CNN the office was involved in counterterrorism and counterintelligence. The official says no CIA employees were killed in the collapse.
Number 7 World Trade Center was also the New York office of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA ordered the building surrounded by FBI agents shortly after it collapsed.
It housed the offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the joint FBI-CIA counterterrorism group that ironically tracked bin Laden. It was a spook house, filled with intelligence officials. The building was over-designed to withstand serious structural damage, for it was used by the city for emergency response purposes in a terror attack. The tower was standing for about 7 hours until it came down. And when it did come down, it happened in 6.5 seconds. News agencies quickly reported that the building fell due to fires. However, there was just one problem. CNN and the BBC reported the collapse of the building around 30 minutes before it actually happened.
The complex is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And you, to be honest, can see these pictures a little bit more clearly than I. But building number 7, one of the buildings in this very large complex of buildings that is the Trade Center, there were, and that is the right way to put it.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing, and indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense...
As the building collapse is discussed for almost 20 minutes, the feed of Jane Stanley is cut seconds before the building actually does collapse.
Many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan. Perhaps we can read